Good morning, everyone. Let me extend a warm welcome to all of you to the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards Stakeholder Consultation on the draft voluntary standard for wastewater reuse for agricultural and other applications. It is indeed a very opportune time for us to be discussing this very pertinent issue. And we are happy for all of you who have taken the time today to join us in this very important discussion. As you all would notice, we have a rotating screen that is indicating our agenda, where we will be able to provide some amount of context before we get into a question and answer session to try to address any of the concerns, inputs from you as our very valued stakeholders. You would have also noted in that revolving screen some housekeeping pertaining to our Zoom meeting. So bear that in mind. Just to add that we are asking that you please use the chat to present or to propose your questions, which will be addressed in the question and answer session a little later on in our discussion. So again, let me extend warm welcome. My name is Gaius Eudoxie. I'll be your moderator for the first part of our formal proceedings. I'm a senior lecturer and deputy dean of outreach of the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. And I also serve as the chair of the specifications committee for this very important standard. So once again, we're asking for your engagement and interaction such that we could guarantee that this standard serves the needs of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, and that we can all move forward with regards to improving the efficiency of not only our water, but our wastewater towards an integrated water resources management framework. So with this little welcome, it is my pleasure to now move on and invite Mr. Rodney Ramnath, Executive Director Acting of the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards, to provide some opening remarks. Mr. Ramnath, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Dr. Eudoxie. Just confirming that you can hear me properly.
Yes, we are. Thank you so very much.
Okay. Good morning again, everyone. I am pleased to welcome all of you to this stakeholder consultation on the draft voluntary standard TTS 664 for wastewater reuse, agricultural and other applications requirements. This standard establishes the sampling, testing, and maximum permissible limits for key parameters related to wastewater reuse for various applications, including agriculture, irrigation of crops and washing of animal enclosures, and landscape irrigation. Conversely, the standard does not provide the permissible limits for wastewater use for industrial or construction applications, cleaning roads or buildings, potable water, or any other form of reuse not specified in this draft standard. The purpose of this consultation is to highlight the key requirements of this draft voluntary standard and to solicit feedback with the aim of finalizing the standard. TTBS is pleased to collaborate with the Ministry of Public Utilities, the Environmental Management Authority, EMA, and the Water and Sewage Authority, WASA, in the development of this draft standard. At this point, I would like to express my gratitude to the following key stakeholders in attendance: Chairperson and Vice Chairperson of the Specification Committee for Wastewater Reuse from the Faculty of Food and Agriculture, UE, namely Dr. Gaius Eudoxie and Dr. Ronald Rupnarine, respectively. Ms. Samantha Gangapasad from the Ministry of Public Utilities, Ms. Vidya Ramkalawan and Mr. Travis Suknanan from the Environmental Management Authority, AKUT Technical Consultant, Mr. Christoph Platzer, for providing the technical information in preparation of the working draft standard. Our panelists, who comprise all of the above-mentioned persons, in addition to Dr. Mark Dukaran, Ministry of Health, Mr. Roger Karim, WASA, and Ms. Michelle Shaw, Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries. Members of the Working Group and Specification Committee for Wastewater Reuse for participating in the development of the draft standard, and last but not least, representatives of the Inter-American Development Bank and GIZ, which is the German Development Corporation, who are integrally involved in the CRU+ project, which you will hear a little bit more about during the course of this morning's activities. The development of TTS 664, wastewater reuse, agriculture, and other applications requirements, was undertaken by TTBS to support the establishment of an integrated water resource management framework for Trinidad and Tobago, spearheaded by the Ministry of Public Utilities under the Caribbean Regional Fund on Wastewater Management CRU+ project. When the standard is published, it is anticipated that the EMA will appropriately reference the voluntary standard in the provision of certificates of environmental clearance and water pollution permits under the remit of the Water Pollution Rules 2019. The development of this voluntary standard supports TTBS's strategic plan under its national standardization strategy and is in alignment with our mandate under the Standards Act, Act number 18 of 1997. Globally, wastewater reuse has become significant as the scarcity of water supplies and drought have increased in a number of geographical locations. Over the past decades, the continuous growth in volumes of untreated wastewater, as well as the release of hazardous chemicals and materials into water courses, have created an urgent need to monitor and control water quality in the wastewater receiving water bodies. Additionally, wastewater reuse can provide alternatives to existing water supplies and can be used to enhance water security, sustainability, and resilience in support of the following United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Goal number 6, clean water and sanitation, and goal number 7, responsible consumption and production. Operators of wastewater treatment plants, both public and private, farmers, hoteliers, generators, and users of treated wastewater all stand to benefit from the development of TTS 664. We are therefore keen to hear your views on this draft standard. Your feedback is critical as it will assist TTBS in upholding its mandate to promote public and industrial welfare, health, and safety, and protect the environment. In conclusion, I once again extend a special welcome to all the representatives here today. Your presence emphasizes the fact that all participants and their nominating organizations, where applicable, continue to play a critical role in the development of national standards and the creation of a standards-conscious society. And I wish you a productive and informative session. Thank you all very much. And I will now hand you all back over to the moderator for this morning's proceedings.
Thank you so very much, Edie, for sharing with the audience the importance of an integrated approach, the importance of a coordinated approach, such that even at the level of our institutions, such that we can meet the mandate of all our institutions, and importantly, nationally, meet our development goals. And we do know the significance of water, particular water security, water sustainability, and water resilience. And it is, I'm taking your words and I'm certainly reaffirming to our audience that is an area that we need to pay particular attention to. And as such, we would be looking forward to their lively interaction. Thanks again, Edie, for your opening remarks. Moving on, I will now like to invite Ms. Nadita Ramachala, the manager of the standardization division of the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards, to also provide us some insight into the mandate of TTBS and the standardization process that has brought us to this particular stage. Ms. Ramachala, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Idoxi. So please allow me one moment to share my screen. Okay, good morning, everyone. So just confirming that you all can see my presentation.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I know many of the participants here may be already familiar with the TTBS and its operations, but I'd just like to recap on our mandate as well as the process that we use for standards development. TTBS is a national standards body, and we operate under the Standards Act number 18 of 1997, but we also have several other roles, including the National Quality Certifying Body, National Laboratory Accreditation Body, and our responsibility as a National Measurement Institute is covered under the Metrology Act number 18 of 2004. Some of our key guiding policies and strategies would be our national quality policy, and this document establishes requirements for Trinidad and Tobago in terms of our national quality infrastructure. I encourage all participants to take a look at this policy because it is not just TTBS's responsibility. Regulators, ministries, consumers, the private sector, NGOs, we all have a role to play ensuring that we have an infrastructure that could support our sustainable development, stimulate our competitiveness as a trading country, and basically improve our overall global competitiveness. For standardization as well, we also have our national standardization strategy, and I will touch on that in a later slide. We also report to the Ministry of Trade and Industry, which is our line ministry. So I'll now touch on our vision, mission, and TTBS is, the national standards body. We also have several other roles related to conformity assessment. So we'd like to be the essential provider of national quality solutions, leading to a standards conscious society that is globally competitive. To fulfill that vision, we also have our mission statement to champion the development and implementation of standards, measurement systems, conformity assessment services for the competitiveness and sustainability of Trinidad and Tobago. I would just like to highlight some of our key business operations. So today we have our standardization division, basically, engaging with stakeholders with the support of all our committee members in terms of developing a national standard, and we're responsible for regional and international standardization and coordinating our national input into these activities. We have metrology, as I indicated before. We also have an implementation division, and they're primarily responsible for enforcing our compulsory standards, and I'll touch on compulsory standards later on. We also have a certification division, and they also support some of the regulatory aspects of TTBS, but they also provide services such as management, system certification, products certification, and we have a well-established certification scheme for tourism services. To support the overall mandate of TTBS and the needs of the business community, the private sector, etc., we also have a number of laboratories covering chemical, electrical, material, and fiber products. I'd now like to go into our standards-related mandate. According to the Standards Act number 18 of 1997, TTBS is responsible for promoting and encouraging the development and maintenance of standards. And generally, we develop standards for the improvement of goods produced or used in Trinidad and Tobago, also to support industrial efficiency and development, and as well as promoting public and industrial welfare, health and safety. And for the last item, for the protection of the environment, this is one of our key standards projects that directly supports the protection of the environment. And we are happy to collaborate with the key ministries and agencies such as the EMA and the Ministry of Public Utilities, as well as academia, to support the development of this very important standard. To fulfill our mandate, we participate in different levels of standardization. We have the international level, and you may be familiar with ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, and they're responsible for developing a number of international standards such as ISO 9001 covering quality management, and you may also be familiar with 14001 covering environmental management systems. There's also another very important international standards body called the IEC, or the International Electrotechnical Commission. They are responsible for standardizing electrical products, services, etc. And at our regional level, our foremost regional engagement would be with the CARICOM level, and this is through CROSSQ, the CARICOM Regional Organization for Standards and Quality. But at the regional level, we also have COPANS, and this is the Pan-American Standards Commission. They engage with stakeholders from North America, Latin America, as well as the Caribbean, and it really promotes the exchange of best practice related to standardization. So we're happy to participate at the regional level. And of course, because we have our CARICOM arrangements, we are directly involved and participate quite actively in CROSSQ. And of course, at TTBS, we perform national standardization activities. I'm sure that most of you all here would be familiar with a standard, but to just bring the idea and recap and to bring it home, it is a technical document that provides an agreed upon repeatable way of doing something. Therefore, doing stakeholder engagements like this means that we can directly engage with stakeholders, get your direct feedback, and help us improve the document. They provide a commonly accepted and repeatable way of defining objective technical requirements of products. And of course, when I say products, I mean both goods and services. Standards are generally used to foster trade, protect public health and safety, preserve the environment, promote innovation. I should mention that a lot of the international and regional standardization activities now are focused on sustainability issues so that we can support the UN Sustainable Development Goals and fulfill that environmental mandate that we have as public agencies. Standards are generally part of our daily life. Anything grown, produced, and traded is subject to standards. So there are standards behind the technology that we use, the services that are offered, and generally we may not understand that behind safe products, there's a body of evidence around that. So best practice and technical requirements captured in standards, as well as supported by our conformity assessment activities. And this would include testing, certification, having proper measurements, and the entire gamut of what we consider the national quality infrastructure. At the TTBS, and I just wanted to provide some clarification on the types of standards that we can develop. So first off, we have voluntary standards, and the standard that we're here to talk about, wastewater reuse, is one of those standards that would be voluntary. They represent minimum levels of acceptability for a product or service. They can be adopted at the discretion of business, and they're market-driven. On the other hand, we have compulsory standards, and this is where TTBS has some regulatory functions. The requirements of a compulsory standard are legally enforceable by TTBS. The standard is given compulsory status by the Minister of Trade and Industry, and generally standards that are compulsory have a significant impact on health, safety, the environment, or even consumer protection. Now, I should mention as well that we also have standards that are voluntary, but they are enforced by another agency, and thereby the requirements of the voluntary standard become mandatory. A key example that we have, and it is very well known, would be our electrical wiring code, and this standard is enforced by the Electrical Inspectorate Division, which falls under the Ministry of Public Utilities. So we have our electrical code, it is voluntary, but again, being enforced by another regulator. I wanted to touch briefly on the standards development process. So first off, we have the need being identified. We have our national standardization strategy. We would have done a lot of consultations around the national standardization strategy, and it outlines our 3-year work program for standards. So once we have a standard that has been identified and it is based on a particular need, it has to support our national development, and the project has been accepted by TTBS, we would conduct technical and market research. We would prepare a working draft. And what we have in this instance, or through the collaboration, and we'll hear more about the Crew Plus project, is that we were able to get the technical support and have a consultant work with TTBS as well as a number of stakeholders to help prepare the working draft. And a specification committee was established, and this is where we get a wide cross-section of stakeholders involved in the process, directly reviewing the requirements and given their technical expertise. We try to get a balanced committee and ensure that different stakeholders are involved in the process. And of course, it is impossible to include every stakeholder on our committee, which is why we have our public comment period. And this is where we allow feedback from all stakeholders. We would conduct stakeholder engagements like this to get direct feedback. We also advertise information in the daily newspapers as well as social media and try to promote the standard and ensure that we get maximum feedback. When all feedback and those comments come into us, they're reviewed by our specification committee. And we really ask that a technical justification be submitted with the comment, so it allows us to research the issue and make a proper decision on whether the comment should be accepted and update the draft standard accordingly. There has to be a general agreement by the committee members on how we dispose of comments. So it does not say TTBS alone making that determination, but we really value all the stakeholder inputs, and we request comments be submitted with a proper technical justification to help in the disposition or the resolution of our comments. After that, we have some approval processes within TTBS. So all standards are approved by our board of directors, but we also have a subcommittee of the board of directors. We call them the technical and marketing committee. They would first review and really look at the technical requirements or whether we have satisfied the requirements in our Standards Act, and make a recommendation to the board for what we call the declaration of the standard. And this is where the standard is really approved by a board of directors and then it is published. I should mention though, for the compulsory standards, the final approval is done by the Minister of Trade and Industry. So going now into the difference between standards and regulations, and I really wanted to highlight, there are lots of similarities. So we need to ensure transparency, for standards, openness, impartiality, consensus, and consensus being an important point. And this is where there's no sustained opposition to the requirements. So we try to ensure that this is well understood by our committee members and make sure that there's that general agreement and that we can move forward with the draft standard. We have to ensure effectiveness and relevance, coherence, and for the international community, there's issue of development dimension, and this is where technical assistance can be provided by developed countries to developing countries or even among developing countries itself. But I wanted to make the distinction between regulations and regulations being issued by a ministry or department operating under a particular act. We have to ensure efficiency, effectiveness, clarity, equity. And in terms of TTBS, we have to ensure that these requirements are satisfied, especially for our voluntary standards, but more importantly, where we have compulsory standards and we have a regulatory mandate, we have to ensure that we fulfill international requirements under our trade agreements, for example, under the World Trade Organization, technical barriers to trade. And standards can be used very effectively to support public policy. We can support the regulatory work of other agencies, and for TTBS, we have our own compulsory standards that we are responsible for enforcing to ensure that there's compliance for improved health and safety, improved environmental protection, ensuring that the consumers are protected, and just to ensure that there is that equitable trade and environment as well. I wanted to touch on the application of standards, and I would have mentioned already that we have the TTBS regulatory mandate. We generally use an inspection process for a lot of our imported products, And for products that are locally manufactured, we have product certification schemes. So for example, sodium hypochlorite solution, or generally liquid chlorine bleach, roofing sheets, and cement. So we have a lot of construction products that are locally manufactured that fall under a mandatory product certification scheme. Again, a lot of our products that are imported, for example, electrical appliances, accessories, lighting products, consumer goods, they would fall under our inspection process. And for voluntary standards, I would have highlighted the example of our electrical wiring code. And this is where it is incorporated into the regulatory scheme or mechanism of other agencies or ministries, departments, etc. And voluntary standards can be used generally by industry players, so private sector, NGOs, etc. And they can also be used to support third-party certification. So for example, ISO 9000, 14000, we have more recent management systems that fall under, for example, business continuity, governance related issues. There's anti-bribery. We have compliance management systems. So quite a lot of scope for the voluntary adoption supported by certifications. And recently we would have issued a number of standards related to information security management systems. And here we encourage industry to use it, and to go further than that, they can also be certified to these type of standards. Generally, standards, I mentioned that they can be used to support public policy. So they can be referenced or mentioned in national policies. We have a number of different policies. I mentioned the quality policy. We also have policies for climate change. We also have policies that deal with upstream effluent management. So there's a direct role for standards there. They can be referenced in contracts, tender documents, specifications, and procurement policies. So we now have some level of, some stringent requirements for procurement at the national level, and standards can play a critical role there to ensure that we get value for money, which is one of the fundamental aspects of good procurement. They can be used in testing activities. I mentioned the certification part already. So management systems, product certifications. They can also be used by accreditation. So for example, when you hear the term accredited labs, it means that they have fulfilled the requirements for labs to operate at a high level of competence. I highlighted our national standardization strategy already. It is our prioritized listing of standards for a 3-year program. It is based on an ISO methodology using statistical data, and we would have looked at GDP, export potential, social issues, government initiatives, policies, even directives from the government itself, for example, with regard to biodegradable materials. We are looking at supporting the ban on certain types of expanded polystyrene products, and we have done several consultations on that already. The document is available on our TTBS website, so go ttbs.com. And we are looking at reconfirming some of the projects that we have in our national standardization strategy. And later on this year, we will be looking at stakeholder engagements to get additional information in terms of what would be our standards projects over the next 3-year cycle. So please look out for that. And in terms of emerging areas of standardization, I would have highlighted at the international level, there's a lot of trust in terms of sustainability, governance of organizations. One of the more recent examples is that we are looking at the issue of net zero. So there's an active project to develop an international document on net zero guiding principles, climate change, circular economy, e-commerce. So a lot of activities in the area of ICT and supporting digital transformation. So please contact us if you need any further information, or if you would like to get involved in our national, regional, or international standardization activities. You'll have my contact, and Beverly's contact is already available. So any perspectives that you'd like to share with us in terms of what are the areas of standardization we should focus on, please let us know. So thank you for your time, and this is the end of my very brief presentation. I'll turn you over back to the moderator. So thank you.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Ramachala, for sharing with the audience the scope and depth of what the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards works in, especially the standardization unit, and for also sharing with us some context for us to understand the types of standards that are available and how they can be applied to our overall development and our overall strategy for growth. So once again, we extend our thanks to you for sharing that information with us. I am sure our audience are now more appraised of the process and understand the depth at which that process unfolds to get us to those standards that are so important in our lives. I want to, at this particular point in time, just extend an apology for not properly introducing Ms. Ramachala. And at this point in time, I will still go ahead and do so. And before we move on, so that our audience is aware of Ms. Ramachala bio to ensure that if they need to get onto her, that they can. So just let me spend a moment just to read out for you Ms. Ramachala's bio. And we already know she's the manager of the standardization division. She has over 15 years of experience in the development of Trinidad and Tobago standards. And I'm sure by the presentation just delivered, you all are particularly aware of her professionalism and experience in that area. She focuses mainly in the area of electrical engineering. She was responsible for the formulation of a number of standards in the electrical field, including lighting products, electrical cables and appliances, as well as the National Electrical Wiring Code. In addition to that, also in renewable energy systems. She holds a BSc degree in electrical and computer engineering from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus, as well as a Master's of Science degree in project management and a Master's of Business Administration. Her training includes standards development, quality management systems, including our ISO 9001 energy management systems, ISO 50001, as well as national quality infrastructure development. So you all are very well aware that our Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards, particularly our standardization division, is in very good hands. And again, I would just like to extend our thanks to Ms. Ramachala for sharing with us the significant work that the Bureau of Standards is doing, and obviously the importance for us to make sure that we also contribute to that work. So without any further ado, I would like to move on in our agenda to now welcoming Ms. Samantha Ganga-Prasad, Associate Professional from the Ministry of Public Utilities. Ms. Ganga-Prasad completed a bachelor's degree in materials engineering at McGill University in Canada. Following this, she worked as a research assistant at the university on explorative methods for recovering nutrients from both liquid and solid streams of domestic wastewater. Samantha is currently working for the Ministry of Public Utilities in Trinidad and Tobago in the water sector unit of the Economic Research Policy and Planning Division to conceptualize and facilitate wastewater projects. So today, Ms. Ganga-Prasad will do an overview for us of the Q Plus project and wastewater initiatives in Trinidad and Tobago. Samantha, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Gaius. And a warm welcome to all of the stakeholders that are here today. And of course, thank you to TTBS for organizing this forum. So today I'll be representing the Ministry of Public Utilities, and I'll be presenting an overview of our wastewater initiatives, of the country's wastewater initiatives, and our participation in the Crew Plus project. I'd just like to confirm that you all can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay. I'm just making, can you see that the slide flipped?
The first slide remains on screen. Not sure that, yeah.
Let me stop share and reshare. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Okay, so this is an overview of wastewater management in the country. So we can see that 7% of wastewater goes to latrines. The majority, 53%, would go to on-site treatment. This includes septic tanks, soakaway systems, and the remaining is centralized treatment. So centralized treatment, this is when wastewater is collected and transported to somewhere, an external facility where it is then treated, and 30% of the 40% is operated by WASA and 10% private centralized treatment. So this is the wastewater ecosystem in Trinidad and Tobago. So we'll see all of the major players, all of the stakeholders here. We'll begin with the policymakers. This includes the Ministry of Public Utilities, Tobago Houses of Assembly, the Ministry of Planning and Development, and of course regulators, EMA, the RIC, Ministry of Health, WASA, and operators. Operators include HTC, private operators, FMCOL, regional corporations, and of course the Water and Sewage Authority. So at the Ministry of Public Utilities, we have been developing a national integrated water resource management policy. And this policy being developed is an overarching policy for water resource management that will help us to meet our current water demand as well as to account for future demand and allow us to meet future demand. So the policy does speak to wastewater management, and there are 6 policy prescriptions related to wastewater management. And I'll just briefly go through these prescriptions. The first is to improve the quality of wastewater effluent, to maintain and upgrade existing wastewater collection, treatment, and disposal systems, to pursue the integration of smaller wastewater plants into larger plants. The policy also speaks to economic investment related to the operation of public and private wastewater systems. Additionally, it speaks to standards for industrial waste, the establishment of standards for industrial waste. And lastly, the 6th prescription is to pursue the reuse of wastewater and produced water as a means of meeting demand for industrial and agricultural water. And that's what we're here for today. We're trying to accomplish the 6th policy prescription through the development of this standards. It is definitely in alignment with the NIWRM policy. And just to clarify, we're focusing on the reuse of wastewater for agricultural water, not industrial as stated here. So the wastewater initiatives in Trinidad and Tobago, I'll just briefly go through some of the major ongoing and recently completed initiatives. Firstly, the major wastewater rehabilitation projects. So there has been major rehabilitation works in San Fernando and Malabar, where there was the construction of new wastewater treatment plants as well as collection systems to replace old infrastructure. And there's also been major works undertaken to increase the wastewater network and increase treatment in the country. This includes the construction of the Trin City wastewater treatment plant and collection system, as well as an integrated wastewater treatment system in Southwest Tobago. Additionally, there has been the adoption of wastewater assets from HTC to WASA as mandated by Cabinet. Also, Thirdly, WASA has been working on their business plan, which is being finalized internally for submission to the RIC. And of course, the water pollution rules in 2019, which is especially relevant today because the new water pollution rules state that effluent discharged into natural water bodies, those that discharge effluent and which would implicate wastewater, those that manage wastewater would now be charged a fee based on the pollutants that are being discharged in order to protect the environment. This, however, this fee could be exorbitant and it would have financial implications on the wastewater managers. So the water pollution rules revision in 2019 actually serves as an indirect driver towards wastewater reuse, because an alternative to treating and discharging wastewater is to reuse wastewater. And of course, we need good standards in order to reuse wastewater. Another initiative that we have been participating in as a country is the CREW Plus initiative, which is a regional program. And as a part of this initiative, we have been developing wastewater reuse standards. I will move on now to describe the CREW Plus initiative, which was mentioned earlier by Mr. Ramnath from TTBS. So CREW Plus, this is a regional initiative. It's being financed by the Global Environment Facility, and it's being implemented by IDB and UNEP, co-executed by the Caribbean Environment Program, GIZ, and the Organization of American States. And the CREW Plus project aims to approach wastewater and water management in the region using innovative solutions and promoting financing mechanisms. And it's taking place amongst 18 Caribbean countries, including Trinidad and Tobago, of course. Okay, so in Trinidad and Tobago, we have developed our national program under CREW Plus. The previous water sector specialist at the ministry spearheaded the development of our list of projects that we would be implementing in Trinidad and Tobago under the CREW Plus initiative. Under CREW Plus, there are 3 components. Under the first component, which is institutional, policy, legislative, and regulatory reforms for integrated water and wastewater management, in Trinidad and Tobago, we have seen the need for wastewater reuse standard development, as well as the National Water Information Management Platform. So this second project is the development of an online platform which would have real-time data, real-time water-related data that would serve many purposes. For example, to facilitate research, to make evidence-based policy decisions, to allow for better public communication. So this is one of the other projects in addition to wastewater reuse standard that's being done under CREW Plus. Also projects that we hope to implement, we hope to begin and commence soon, is the willingness to pay study and a communication strategy for tariff setting. We hope that this will complement the work that WASA is doing on their business plan. Additionally, there's a 4th component under the CREW Plus project, and this is the Northeast Tobago Wastewater and Water Improvement Program. And this project will be a local community-based project in Charlottesville, Tobago. And the objective for this project is to have educational campaigns for the people there to distribute low-tech equipment like shower heads to help with water conservation and sink strainers to improve wastewater quality. So now I'll dive more deeply into the wastewater reuse standard project under CREW Plus. So for this project, we have 3 phases. There's been we have seen the completion of the baseline assessment, now working on the development of the standard being spearheaded by TTBS, for which we are here today. And then finally, we will have targeted campaigns. One thing that we are very keen to do at the ministry is to have a pre-campaign CAP survey, a knowledge, attitudes, and practices survey, as well as a post-campaign survey at the end of the educational campaign. So the baseline assessment that has been conducted and completed as the first phase of the CRU Plus project provided a national context for the wastewater reuse standard. We identified useful information. We know that it is, while wastewater reuse isn't being done currently, it is economically feasible, particularly for agriculture and landscaping. And there are policies that would contribute to the sector that exists. So this assessment was able to give us a good starting point for the development of the standard. So TTPS already spoke to their very thorough standard development process. One thing I will add about the development of the standard was that under the CRU Plus project, we had the hiring of the consultant, Acute, and this consultant surveyed over 57 international standards that would have given us very thorough research basis to build the standard upon. So the CAP survey, what we want to do before moving on to targeted campaigns is to disperse a survey. This survey, we want to gather information about the knowledge, attitudes, and practices of stakeholders involved in agriculture, as well as irrigation of public and private green spaces. So we want to understand their knowledge, attitudes, and practices as it pertains to wastewater reuse. And it's 20 questions, would take 5 to 10 minutes. We are launching the survey now. I will share the link in the chat, and I hope that all the stakeholders here today will take the survey. And I'll also reach out for assistance with further disbursement of the survey later on to a few of the key stakeholders. The purpose of this survey is to inform the targeted campaigns, which is the third phase of the CRU Plus project on wastewater reuse. So this is how we are planning to approach wastewater reuse in Trinidad and Tobago. This is the strategy developed by the Ministry of Public Utilities, or under the leadership of the previous specialist. So we will do this pre-campaign survey. We'll send a link. Now we will discuss further, and the purpose will be to inform the educational campaigns. We hope that the educational campaigns will reach stakeholders. We want to inform it so that we can take a more real-time approach using the current knowledge level of stakeholders as we develop educational materials. And we hope that the knowledge that is shared during the campaign will provide a good basis and will provide stakeholders with the knowledge that they need for future discussions that will then lead to the implementation of wastewater reuse. And of course, we would like to do a post-campaign survey to assess the success of the targeted educational campaigns, as well as to inform implementation of wastewater reuse, which will follow this work. So feel free to email me if you have any questions or concerns. Also, questions you can place in the chat, and we will answer them during the question and answer period. Thanks very much.
Thank you so very much, Samantha, for sharing with the audience the CRU Plus project, as well as the other initiatives, particularly under the IWRM policy of Trinidad and Tobago, that are very critical towards our management of our water and wastewater sectors. I think at this particular point in time, I also want to remind participants to please ensure that you place all your questions in the chat, and we will get to all your questions. We have a very good lineup of panelists across the various coordinating and participating institutions to help guide that discussion on areas of concern that you may have. So please feel free to share with us all your questions at this particular point in time and throughout in the chat. I also wanted to just indicate as well that your participation continues as invited by Samantha, even after this public consultation through a very targeted educational as well as public awareness campaign. And again, we will appreciate your continued support to ensure that this reality in terms of improving of our wastewater use occurs. So without any further ado, I would like to move on into our agenda and now welcome Mr. Travis Suknanan, Environmental Program Officer 2 from the Environmental Management Authority. Mr. Suknanan is an Environmental Program Officer with the Water and Waste Units Technical Services Department of the EMA. He has over 13 years experience in environmental regulatory management and is currently responsible for the implementation of the Water Pollution Rules 2019. He holds a BSc in Civil and Environmental Engineering from the UE, as well as an MSc in Water and Wastewater Management Services from UE. Mr. Suknanan will present to us an overview of the Water Pollution Rules 2019 and implementation of the standard TSS 664. Mr. Suknanan, the floor is yours. Please proceed.
Thank you. Good morning. Just confirming that everyone could hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Wonderful. Okay. Good morning again. Welcome to our presentation. In this presentation, we will look at the EMA's legislation as it relates to wastewater regulation, explain some features of the Water Pollution Rules 2019, including the objectives of the rules, the various processes under the rules, and the schedules under the rules that further defines water pollutants. And finally, illustrate how the TTS 664 relates to the Water Pollution Rules 2019. Under the umbrella of the Environmental Management Act, Chapter 3505, the EMA is empowered by several pieces of subsidiary legislation. Highlighted here are the Certificate of Environmental Clearance Rules and the Water Pollution Rules, which are the main legislative tools under which wastewater discharge is regulated. Related to wastewater discharge, most new facilities or facilities modified since 2001 would require a Certificate of Environmental Clearance. Facilities in existence before 2001 or facilities without a CEC but with an effluent discharge would be targeted for water pollution permitting under the Water Pollution Rules. Terms and conditions for both permits require effluent discharge to be in compliance with Schedule 2 of the Water Pollution Rules, which will be mentioned later on. As it pertains to the CEC rules, the CEC process determines potential environmental impacts that may arise out of new or significantly modified activities that fall within the prescribed list of designated activities. Where applicable, a CEC permit is issued with conditions. These conditions may specify wastewater treatment, effluent management, and wastewater monitoring. Facilities proposing to reuse treated wastewater may be guided in the issued CEC permit to comply with the standards outlined in the TTS 664. The Water Pollution Rules 2001 was implemented from May 2007 to September 2019. These rules were revoked and replaced with the WPR 2019, effective October 10, 2019. The revision was necessary to encourage an integrated approach to wastewater management, both point and non-point sources, with the goal of reducing the introduction of water pollutants into the environment and promoting the reuse of wastewater through the water pollution permitting process. This is a brief overview of the water pollution permitting process. At step 1, a facility with point source discharge submits an application to the EMA. The EMA will review details of the application inclusive of effluent data. The data is compared with Schedules 1 and 2 of the Water Pollution Rules And if it is determined that there is an exceedance with at least one parameter, a water pollution permit is issued. The water pollution permit guides the facility to ensure that the effluent meets the permissible limits set out in Schedule 2. Water pollution permits are valid for a period of 5 years. Once the facility is compliant with Schedule 2, the water pollution permit will not be required to be renewed. In future, however, the facility may also be required to implement a watershed improvement plan. As mentioned in the previous slides, these are the schedules of the water pollution rules. Schedule 1 contains 28 substances or parameters and the concentrations at which these are considered to be water pollutants. Schedule 2 are the end of pipe or discharge standards, and they contain permissible limits established for the 28 substances in Schedule 1 for 4 different receiving environments. These are inland surface waters, coastal nearshore, marine offshore, and environmentally sensitive areas and groundwater. Schedule 2 pertains to ambient water quality standards. This is a sample of what Schedule 2 would look like. On the left column, you can see that there's a list of water pollutants, and on the right columns, there are receiving environments, which contain the corresponding permissible levels for each parameter. An application fee is charged upon submission of each water pollution permit application. When the application is submitted with effluent discharge data from the facility, the EMA will review and verify the discharge volume. The volume is then used to categorize the facility type. On the left-hand side, you would see micro, mini, small, medium, and large, and determine the amount to be paid, which is the corresponding values on the right middle column. Discharge fee, a yearly fee is applied to permit holders based on their effluent discharge quality. The discharge fee is taken to be the sum of monitoring and inspection fees and the pollutant load minus discount for beneficial use of effluent U, and this is done to encourage reuse of wastewater. As previously mentioned, the TTS 664 provides voluntary standards for treated wastewater reuse. The standards are intended for use by private and public wastewater treatment plants that generate wastewater for reuse and entities receiving treated wastewater for reuse. Similarly, the water pollution rules regulates permitted facilities that generate wastewater, and these facilities are encouraged to reuse treated wastewater through beneficial use, which is the discount applied to the discharge fee. Hence, the TTS 664 provides a support and incentive for a permitted facility to reuse wastewater, which in turn strengthens and supports the water pollution rules. This is just an overview of what was presented. To summarize, point source wastewater discharge regulated through water pollution permits is regulated through water pollution permits or certificate of environmental clearance, and at both times, compliance is necessary with the Schedule 2 of the water pollution rules. Under the Certificate of Environmental Clearance, CEC, where a person or entity indicates their intention to reuse wastewater for agricultural or irrigation purposes, the issued CEC can include a condition referring to the TTS 664. And under the water pollution permit, where during the term of an issued permit, a person or entity demonstrates that they have reused some of their effluents in accordance with the TTS 664, in calculating the annual discharge fee, this can be considered as a beneficial use and subsequently applied as a discount. Thank you very much. And this is how you can contact the EMA with any questions. And that's the end of my short presentation.
Thank you so very much, Travis, for sharing with the audience the way in which TTS 664 can be potentially integrated into the existing Water Pollution Rules 2019, particularly at the benefit of those already permitted to discharge waste into receiving environments. Wonderful. So we are going to move on, and we have had presentations that have certainly provided us with significant context and shows the integrated approach in what was the path to generate the particular standard that we are hoping to get your engagement on. So without further ado, I would like to now invite Mrs. Beverly Monroe to do her presentation. Mrs. Monroe is a Senior Standards Officer in the Standardization Division of the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards and is responsible for the chemical portfolio, garments, and textiles. She has a BSc degree in chemistry from the UE, a master's degree in business administration from Heriot-Watt University, and a Bachelor of Laws degree from the University of London. She has worked both in the implementation and standardization divisions of the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards and has experience in both conformity assessment and standardization issues. So it is a pleasure for me to welcome Mrs. Monroe to do a presentation on the proposed requirements of TTS 664, wastewater reuse, agricultural and other applications requirements. Beverly, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eudoxie. Just confirming that you can see my presentation and hear me clearly.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so good morning to everyone. Today I will be providing an overview of the proposed voluntary standard for wastewater reuse. The number of the standard is TT664, and the title of the standard is Wastewater Reuse, Agricultural and Other Applications Requirements. And when we speak of wastewater, we speak of wastewater with domestic characteristics. So that is wastewater from residential settlements and services such as houses, and which originates predominantly from toilets, bathrooms, and kitchens. So today I will be speaking about the background of the standard, the scope, key requirements, key milestones, and next steps. So you would have heard from Ms. Ganga Prasad that TTBS participates on the CRUPLUS project. Just to remind you that CRUPLUS stands for Caribbean Regional Fund on Wastewater Management, and a need was identified for a standard for wastewater reuse to support an integrated water resource management framework. And the baseline study or survey was conducted by Dr. Ronald Rupnerine and his team, and they identified agriculture and landscaping as feasible applications for wastewater reuse. And so TTBS took a decision to develop a national voluntary standard for wastewater reuse. And we have established a specification committee for wastewater reuse. That committee was charged with the responsibility of developing the committee draft standard, which is the draft standard that is currently posted on the website for review and for commenting. So please feel free to go to our website, go to ttbs.com, and access a copy of the standard and submit your comments. And these are the names of the members of our specification committee. I know it's very difficult to see the names at this point in time. I just want to highlight that our chairman is Dr. Gaius Eudoxie, who is our moderator today. So thank you so much for moderating. And also our vice chairman is Dr. Ronald Rupnerine. And we have representatives from many different state agencies, such as Public Health Services Division from Ministry of Health, Ministry of Public Utilities, NAMDEVCO. Also the private sector was involved in the committee. So Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Industry and Commerce, Water and Sewage Authority, Water Resources Agency, Tobago House of Assembly, and we have our very own CUT consultant, and his name is Dr. Christoph Platzer, and he was charged with the responsibility of developing the working draft standard. And Tobago Tourism Agency, Environmental Management Authority, Institute of Marine Affairs, Agricultural Society of Trinidad and Tobago, Ministry of Agriculture, Lands and Fisheries, and of course Trinidad and Tobago's Manufacturers Association, Trinidad Tourism Limited, and TTBS. So who are the intended users of this voluntary standard? Well, any farmers can use treated wastewater to irrigate their crops. Operators of wastewater treatment plants, and that is private sector and public sector wastewater treatment plants, can utilize the standard to ensure that they conform to the requirements of the standard to ensure that the water that is used is safe for use. And we have hoteliers, organizations, and state agencies can use treated wastewater to irrigate their green spaces. Also, regulators, and you would have heard from the EME, they can reference our voluntary standard in their permits and their CEC agreements. So what is the scope of the standard? Meaning, what does the standard cover? This standard establishes maximum permissible limits for key parameters of treated wastewater related to the following applications. And now here we have 3 classes of applications. So class A, class B, and class C. And these classes would have been modified from the classes used in the European Union, countries like Greece, Italy, Portugal, Spain. So class A speaks to the irrigation of crops to be eaten uncooked. So for example, lettuce, kale, peppers. Also landscape irrigation of all green public areas, including but not limited to gardens, sports fields, golf courses, or golf courses as we call them, and parks without access limitation, and washing of enclosures for animals. There's also a class B, irrigation of cereal crops like rice, industrial crops like sugarcane, fodder crops like maize or corn, pasture, trees, and also crops to be eaten cooked only. And class C, localized irrigation of areas without public access, and these like forested areas, also areas that are designated for vegetative recuperation as well. And crops in class B, if exposure of workers does not occur. So if they are automated systems, would fall under class C. So key requirements of TTS 664. So we have here our 3 classes, A, B, and C. And you would notice that the limits become less stringent as we move from classes A to B to C, and that's because there's less of a risk pertaining to the negative impact on consumers and laborers working with the wastewater. And how did we derive these parameters and limits? Well, our consultant, Dr. Platzer, would have reviewed 57 documents and regulations, including documents from the Food and Agricultural Organization, the World Health Organization, regulations from the US and Canada, including EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, also national standards from Peru, Colombia, Chile, Costa Rica. And we would have included the most critical parameters in our standard here with accompanying limits, right? So we have 7 parameters here. And we're starting with helminth ova. What is it? It's a parasitic worm that can negatively impact humans. And the requirement is less than or equal to 1 ova per 1 liter sample of wastewater, right? Class B is the same thing, and class C not applicable. And this limit was benchmarked against the WHO requirements, right? We have 2 parameters here that speak to fecal contamination. So we have the Escherichia coli or the E. coli, and we have fecal coliform. So E. coli is a type of bacteria that is found in the intestines of warm-blooded animals, and it gives an indication of contamination with human excreta, and it can lead to typhoid and dysentery if found in large amounts. And the fecal coliform bacteria that live in waste material like feces, and they indicate the presence of pathogenic organisms. Now you'd see 2 different limits here. And for E. coli, we have the geometric mean, which is less than or equal to 126, and the statistical threshold value, which is less than or equal to 410. So you must comply with either one of them. And what do they mean? The geometric mean is the average of a number of samples, and it provides a central tendency of water quality. And the statistical threshold value is the amount of variability in the water quality. And these limits are aligned to our GAP standard, which is the Good Agricultural Practices Fresh Produce Requirements, which is TTS 648/2020. And it's also in alignment with the US Food Safety Modernization Act. So if we have any farmers on the session today and you're desirous of exporting your fresh produce to the US, you need to comply with these requirements here. Class B not applicable, class C not applicable. Fecal coliform is less than or equal to 400 colony forming units per 100 mils of sample. And this value is aligned to the Water Pollution Rules 2019, as you would have heard previously. Class B not applicable, Class C not applicable. Then there are two parameters here for COD and BOD, and they both indicate the organic content of water. So if they're very high, it can lead to unpleasant odors of the water, and it can also increase the potential for microbial growth. So what is COD? It's a chemical oxygen demand, which is the amount of dissolved oxygen required to chemically oxidize organic compounds in water. And what is BOD? It's a 5-day biological oxygen demand, which is the amount of oxygen consumed by microorganisms to decompose organic matter at a specified temperature over a 5-day period. So the users of the standard and also the regulator can determine whether they test for COD or BOD. And the advantage of testing for COD is you can receive your test results in 3 hours as opposed to BOD, which takes 5 days, right? The next parameter is turbidity, which is a measure of clarity of wastewater. And high turbidity results in clogging of any of the water equipment and odor generation, right? And it is measured in the nephelometric turbidity units, that's NTU here. And the value is less than or equal to 10 and not applicable for classes B and C. All right, so the next parameter here is the total residual chlorine, which is the total amount of total amount of free and combined chlorine existing in the water. So if this value is too high, it can result in scorched or burnt appearance of leaves. Now, the user of the standard only needs to test for chlorine if chlorine is used in wastewater disinfection. And the value here is less than or equal to 1, which is in alignment with the US EPA, Class B less than or equal to 1, and Class C not applicable. Okay, so as we go along, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll answer all your questions at the end of the session. So I now move on to the key milestones for this standard project, and we have spanning this year, 2022. So the need was identified in February, and in March, we had our working group prepare the working draft standard, and the working group comprised of the Environmental Management Authority, Ministry of Public Utilities, our COOT consultant, UE, and TTBS. And in April to May, our specification committee deliberated on the development of the committee draft standard. And the standard was issued for public comment during the period 24th of June to the 27th of August. So during that period, we solicit feedback. And here we are on the 21st of July, hosting a stakeholder consultation with the aim of receiving feedback on the document. And in September, we will collate all the feedback that we would have received on the standard, and we would have the specification committee reconvened to review and dispose of those comments. And in September to October, we will submit that draft finalized standard to our TTBS's Board of Directors for approval. And then November, December of this year, a legal notice of declaration for the standard will be gazetted in our local gazette, and the standard will be published and be made accessible to the public. So the next steps, again, to recap, collate and review comments on the draft standard, finalize the draft standard, incorporating comments received from stakeholders, solicit approval from TTBS's Board of Directors, and gazette the legal notice and publish the standard. So that is it for me. Thank you so much. Please feel free to access a copy of the document on our website, which is gottbs.com. Feel free to send me any comments that you may have on the document. My email address is beverly.monroe@ttbs.org.tt. Please note that the deadline for comments is the 27th of August, 2022, and we really appreciate your feedback. So you can advise us if you think that maybe we have omitted any critical parameters from the document, or if the limits that we've included are practical and implementable. So we're looking for that type of feedback from you. So that's it for me. Thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to the question and answer session at the end of the webinar. Thank you so much. Back over to you, Dr. Eudoxie.
Thank you, Beverly, for sharing with us TS 664, and I think it is very clear the scope and what the requirements under this particular standard is. And I certainly think that with your presentation, you have now stimulated some amount of activity pertaining to engaging with our participants on this particular standard. So I just want to reiterate again to all our participants, please ensure that you put your questions in the chat so that we may attend to all of them during our question and answer session. So let me certainly again thank Beverly for as well describing what was a very participatory approach, inclusive obviously of this particular session, in getting us to this particular stage where the consultation is happening now. So we have one more presentation before we move on to our engagement. So I would like at this particular point in time to invite Mr. Kester Sulal to do a presentation for us. Just hold on. Mr. Sulal is the officer in charge of the Chemical Products Laboratory at the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards, with responsibility for the management of laboratory services regarding conformity assessment of chemical products, as well as testing of water, wastewater, and industrial effluent. Mr. Sulal is a qualified chemist with 18 years experience and joined the TTBS in September of 2007 as a standards officer with direct reporting to the manager, Laboratory Services Division. So I would like to invite Mr. Sulal to provide for us a presentation on testing of wastewater. Please, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Eudoxie. Just kindly acknowledge that you are hearing me and you're seeing my screen.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so in this presentation, we will illustrate some of the testing requirements necessary to achieve water quality for this standard. Now, some of the points highlighted before in some of the presentations would have touched on sustainability and wastewater reuse. So due to climate change, rapid urbanization, and finite water resources, wastewater reuse is a common practice among the agricultural environment. Therefore, water quality standards are needed for the safe and sustainable practice of wastewater reuse in agriculture. Some of the effects, however, of untreated wastewater reuse applications is worth noting. It is worth noting that irrigation with untreated wastewater leads to bacterial and viral diseases and helminth infections. The choice of appropriate treatment of wastewater and sound irrigation practices are necessary to protect public health and prevent damage to crops and groundwater. So wastewater by itself is contaminated and needs to be treated to be used safely for irrigation and agricultural purposes. So the standard does touch on the different classes, its applications, as well as the recommended treatment levels. So class A would incorporate irrigation of crops to be eaten uncooked, landscape irrigation, washing of enclosures for animals. And the recommended treatment levels include secondary treatment followed by disinfection. Class B, however, includes irrigation of crops, pastures, trees, and crops to be eaten cooked only. The treatment levels for this one, however, is a secondary treatment. Class C incorporates localized irrigation of areas without public access, crops in Class B if exposure of workers does not occur, and this involves secondary treatment. So the standard does define secondary treatment as the biological treatment of wastewater, which removes about 85% of the organic matter in sewage by making use of the bacteria in it. So Beverly would have touched a lot on the actual requirements. I would just like to reiterate, however, that in terms of the E. coli, the treatment would or should be tested for E. coli if applied to irrigation cups to be eaten uncooked. Whereas, say, for instance, fecal coliform treated wastewater should be treated for, should be tested for fecal coliform if applied to landscape irrigation and washing of animal enclosures. In terms of the COD and BOD, treatment should be tested to establish the actual limits for COD and BOD. And residual chlorine, as Beverly did say earlier on, that testing should be done, especially if disinfection involves chlorine. So the TTBS does incorporate a chemical and microbiological lab and is outfitted with some of the most sophisticated equipment necessary for testing water parameters listed in the standard. In terms of the lab testing and its benefits, decision-making based on test results. Test results can be used in conjunction with the scheduled maintenance and verification activities to determine water quality at every stage of the process. In this regard, one can know the load, the expected level of contamination of untreated versus treated wastewater. This information can help in determining whether the treatment is adequate or it needs to be more rigorous. Another benefit is that information about the inherent nutrient content of the wastewater reuse can be used for beneficial purposes. And so in closing, I would like to thank you for your attention, and you can find us using the handles on your screen. And should you have any questions or concerns, of course, you can use the chat box and we will be sure to respond to you. I will now send you over to Dr. Eudoxie, our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Kester, for sharing with our audience. Again, the extent of services available at TTBS and not the professionalism, but certainly the availability of expertise in those particular areas. So we want our audience to recognize that TTBS can support in these areas as well. So we are at this juncture where we would want to now fully engage you, our participants, and try to accommodate as many of your questions as I have been noting coming into the chat pertaining to the application of this particular standard and how this standard will impact not just producers and farmers, but certainly improve on our overall integrated water resources management framework. So to moderate our discussion, question and answer session, I would like to introduce Dr. Ronald Roopnarine. Dr. Roopnarine is a researcher and academic with a thorough background in disaster risk resilience and sustainable land and water resource management. Presently, he's a lecturer in the Faculty of Food and Agriculture, University of the West Indies at the St. Augustine campus, responsible for teaching and development of courses related to agri-environmental disaster risk and climate resilience. Notably, he is also the network manager of Caribbean WaterNet, the Caribbean arm of CapNet UNDP, and a consultant for various international and regional developmental and state agencies. He has amassed significant experience in IWRM, land management, climate change adaptations, with special focus on Caribbean SIDS. So Dr. Roopnarine will, at this particular point, take over and introduce our panelists who will now spend some time engaging with your concerns, questions, and providing responses to same. So I will continue to urge you to please provide us with as many of your comments, inputs, and questions so that the process could be as participatory as possible. Dr. Roopnarine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Eudoxie. Just confirming that you all are hearing me well. It's raining very heavily here on campus. You all are
yes,
hearing? Yeah.
I can hear you, yes.
All right, great. So thank you for the introduction, and thank you to all those who would have presented and provided some sort of background to enable this discussion. I think this is one of the key and most critical parts of the process here today, where we get some feedback and some comments and be able to clear up any questions or concerns you all may have. So in order to do that, we have this Q&A session outfitted with panelists of experts who should be able to provide any clarity on any issues that you may have seen or identified during the process so far. So without any further delay, let me introduce the panelists for today's Q&A. We have Dr. Christoph Platzer, who is the acute technical consultant contracted through the Crew Plus project. We also have Mr. Roger Karim, who is a senior manager, regulatory and emergency management at WASA. We also have Ms. Michelle Shah, who is the Chief Agricultural Engineer in the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries. We also have Dr. Mark Dukaran, who is the Public Health Inspector in the Ministry of Health. And we have Mrs. Vijaya Ramkilawan, who is the Assistant Manager of Technical Services at the EMA. So these persons will be our panelists for today's Q&A. And based on the questions, I will refer them to the pertinent agency who would be able to respond best, noting the nature of the questions that have been posed. So one of the first things that I saw in the chat that was raised quite early was a question by Mr. Richard Rampasad. And I think this is directed to the EMA, and it speaks to the application costs. So I'm asking Mrs. Ramkilawan to provide a short response to this question. What are the reasons or the rationale for the application cost? Mrs. Ramkilawan, over to you.
Thanks, Dr. Ruparan. Yes, and just to clarify, it is Ms. Ramkilawan. Yes, and I actually did respond in the chat, but I can repeat it here. It is a tiered approach that we developed based on the cost for processing, and the categories were defined by Ministry of Labor's categories for businesses. Just to recall as well, before the previous version of the legislation, it was a fixed fee throughout, so it did not matter the size of the facility and the volume of discharge. You would have just been paying one set application fee. But with the 2019 revision, that was changed. And if anybody wants any further information, what I can do is in the group chat, I can put the EMA's website where they can access all the documentation to support.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Ramkilawan. My apologies. I think that is pretty clear, and perhaps if there are any further concerns, as mentioned, you all could indicate in the chat or reach out to the EMA for any further clarification required. There's another question I'm seeing, or comment and a question from Mr. Christopher Chinopu, who is asking about the proposed monitoring regime. I think this question was posed prior to the last presentation. So, Mr. Chinopu, was everything clarified, or is there still a need for this question to be raised to our panel? Noting that it's a small group and we want to encourage some interaction, if you would like, you can unmute your mic, Mr. Chinopu, and clarify. Or perhaps he has stepped away for a bit, but essentially he was asking about the monitoring regime, which I think.
Hello, sorry about that.
Okay,
yes,
fine,
I was asking about the monitoring regime, but I did see in the final presentation the parameters and the testing regimes that were thing. But if they can also share a little bit more about the monitoring regime, because it seems to me that this is going to really require interagency sort of approach. Seeing that when I saw the ecosystem, the regulatory ecosystem that was presented, there were quite a number of organizations that have varying responsibilities and sometimes overlapping responsibilities. So I'd have been very much interested to learn a little bit more about how the committee was viewing this, this actual monitoring and testing. And I had also a follow-up question, if they will also take that in relation to the ambient water quality standards. Will that be following soon? And will this technical committee be the committee that is undertaking that sort of work in relation to ambient water quality monitoring? Because again, to the parameters, because of the parameters, it may make some good sense. Yeah, so a lot of it had to do, that monitoring question was also related to that EMA presentation where they had the tiered approach, but the tiered approach seemed to be also based on the size of organizations. So I also wanted to know if the risk in terms of the type of processes or the type of emissions coming out of the various industries would also be accounted for in relation to the tier, the classification that was afforded. So that is basically my question. Questions actually.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chinopu. Just to note that the standard itself today is sort of, I note the point that you mentioned that there are lots of agencies involved, and I'll pass you on to our EMA colleague to perhaps answer the questions pertaining to the monitoring regimes and so on and so forth. But in response to the emissions and all the other parameters that you mentioned subsequently, the idea is that this standard applies primarily to domestic wastewater from that end, in terms of ambient water quality and so on. And even there were some concerns during the specifications committee meetings where we identified perhaps the need for additional standards to be developed. So there is a process that is ongoing. And just like this one originated, where persons identify the need for certain things, the TTBS, along with the relevant stakeholders, will come together and try to propose these standards going forward. So further to my response, I would like to pass you over again to our colleague, Ms. Ramkilawan, to provide any further insight.
Thanks, Dr. Rivenwright. Okay, so if I get the question correctly, and I'm just referring to the chat group, so if you see my eyes moving, so it's monitoring of the water quality parameters beyond size of industry and how is risk incorporated into that. Okay, so I can speak directly to the water pollution rules and what the discharge monitoring applies under that permitting regime. Okay, so if you are issued a permit, a water pollution permit, or even a certificate of environmental clearance requiring monitoring, we do specify a monitoring regime. It would be a daily average over a particular period of time for depending on the duration of your facility's operation towards meeting compliance with the second schedule. The tiered approach, it does look at industry side, but it actually looks at volume discharge. And while it doesn't exactly specifically talk to risk of emission and parameters, it really follows more the polluter pay principle. So you basically are, whatever you are discharging is what you are being costed for, so to speak. So what we look at is the pollutant loading aspect of it. And so we look at the concentration on your volume and so on and so forth. So I'm seeing a thumbs up, Mr. Chinopu. So I'm going to take that as the question has been answered.
Thanks a lot, Vijaya. So moving on very quickly, we have another question. Well, a series of persons would have asked this question or related questions. And it speaks to why certain parameters, particularly organics as well as heavy metals, were not included in the standard. To answer this, I would refer to our acute technical consultant, Dr. Platzer, as to providing some sort of rationale so participants can understand why these things were omitted from the standard. Dr. Platzer, over to you.
Okay. Hello, and thanks for inviting me for this. I think it's very important to note that this standard refers to domestic wastewater. And that gives us already the answer why heavy metals are not included. Because the danger of heavy metals is absolutely minimum. You really don't have heavy metals in domestic wastewater normally. And therefore, it would be overcomplicating a standard which never will have heavy metals. So that is the reason. And I would like to point out as well, because that might not have been very clear, that for the organic parameters, it's an BOD or COD. So you can choose between those two, which is more convenient for you. Normally standards regarding reuse, they talk with BOD, but BOD is much more complicated in the analysis, and therefore the COD is easier to monitor. And therefore we thought in a modern standard, it would be interesting to have both options, one which is related to the standard to compare it to other standards, and the COD as a more modern parameter, which is more and more used for the supervision of organic parameters. There was as well, if I may continue on this, Ronald, a question to conductivity, which is related to the parameters. We have discussed that in the group as well, and Trinidad and Tobago is a country which has a fairly expressive rainfall, and conductivity is only a problem if its salt is accumulating in the soil and it's not washed out. But we only have certain times of the year we need irrigation in Trinidad and Tobago, and therefore it was decided not to include conductivity. In regard to the question that most processes are using some sort of flocculants, actually most processes in treating domestic wastewater are biologic processes which are not using chemicals. So the danger of conductivity is very low as well. Thank you. Over to you. And if I forgot something, please question me again.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Christoph. I think that makes it clear. And I think we need to reiterate the point that the standards apply primarily to domestic wastewater. And I just want, for clarity, to refer back to you once more. If you could provide sort of a definition of what we consider to be domestic wastewater, just for clarity.
Yeah. Domestic wastewater is wastewater which basically, if you have a household, what comes out of this household, that would be domestic wastewater. So we are talking about 50 to 60 grams of BOD per person equivalent, which makes up to 300 to 400 BOD in the raw effluent. You have nutrients, you have phosphorus, which are desired in the agricultural use. You don't have any heavy metals normally, and the content of salt is as well very low. A preoccupation is helmet over and coliforms, which are included in the standard. And I saw another question about helmet over. Yes, helmet over are included for class A and class B, where we might have a direct contact for a worker or as well for crops, which are meant for eating. Only in class C, where we don't have any contact directly from workers or from crops who are meant for eating, there is allowed to have, there's no limit for helmet over. Yeah, the coliform, it's as well an or fecal coliform. are in alliance with the standards in Trinidad and Tobago for the effluent of the treatment plant.
Hey, thanks very much. I think that brings some clarity to the process. The other thing that I wanted to mention is the process or the standard itself is really not, it's meant to be safe, but it's not meant to be too stringent, because the idea is to encourage wastewater reuse and to get us to a point of, circular economy principles and so on and so forth. So just as an anecdotal point, I thought it would be necessary to raise that. We have another question here that I think the person best suited to respond to would be our colleague from WASA, Mr. Karim. And it speaks to how does a farmer that is above the 400 CFU per 100 ml be able to bring down to the necessary level required to adhere to this standard. So Mr. Karim, over to you.
Right, morning. Thank you, Dr. Rupmarine. Okay, it's a good question. Well, if it's over 400, generally, you will have to add some sort of disinfectant. And the simplest one that can be used is bleach. And so you'll have to add bleach of a certain concentration that will essentially disinfect or kill off the fecal coliform. Of course, there's a downside to that, in that if you are not managing it properly, you can then have a high level of residual chlorine in the water. And that may also cause a problem in terms of application for crops and so forth. So the easiest way is to add some sort of disinfectant that will bring it down. Generally, in our industry, may use UV lights, but for a farmer, I mean, that will be not only cost prohibitive, but technically impracticable, right? So I hope that sort of answered the question.
Yeah, I think it does. If there are any follow-up questions, feel free to include on the chat as well. Thanks, Mr. Karim. We have a sort of a comment here from Sati Siwa from Kariri, who is saying that fecal coliform, while it can be managed and treated before discharge from a wastewater treatment plant, once discharged into the irrigation system can be influenced by other sources, example, manure, etc. Hence, that would be difficult. The limit would be difficult to meet. In that regard, perhaps the best person to respond to this again would be Mr. Platzer, Dr. Platzer. So Christoph, over to you.
Okay. Again, we come to the point that we are regarding standard for domestic wastewater or alike domestic wastewater. So what you would have to comply with would be if you have a storage, and in the effluent of the storage, you would have to comply with coliform. If you are using manure or are using water from washing stables, this is not included in this particular standard. It might be an interesting standard for the future, but this standard is meant to begin with the reuse of something. It's not globally, it's not related to industrial, it's all this is not included. We are just trying to enhance the domestic wastewater reuse.
Okay, thanks, Christoph. So the idea is it's not an all-encompassing standard. It's one that is meant to kick off the process of reuse in a safe manner for agriculture and landscaping purposes. So thank you very much for that response. I'm seeing another question here that speaks to permissible loads of sulfur, arsenic, heavy metals, and so on. And I think that has been addressed previously. So I would move on. If there is a need for any further clarity, you all can indicate in the chat. So the next question I want to pose is basically, well, it's a follow-up question because of the definition of domestic wastewater. And a question has been posed by Mr. Rampasad. What about farmers that use wastewater from industrial processes? Now, generally speaking, I try to provide a fairly, general response, and I could refer to my colleague from the EMA to provide further clarity if necessary, is that all the industrial waste or industrial wastewater must meet the water pollution rules. And we know that in some cases, farmers utilize water directly from rivers and streams, but technically speaking, all that effluent should be following the water pollution rules. And it's a little bit different from what we are trying to address in this case. So Vijaya, if you have any further point to make on that, please, feel free. Anything?
No, I think you covered it.
All right, great. All right. I am not seeing any questions. Okay, I'm seeing one more just posted here. It's regarding monitoring and compliance. What technology is being recommended to support the implementation of the standard? In that case, I think we could pose a question to perhaps our EMA colleague or our colleague from WASA. So I will pass on this to Mr. Karim.
Okay, all right, thank you again. All right, well, once the water, so if the water is being produced or discharged from any WASA facility, then as per normal, WASA does its internal testing because we do have a lab with all necessary equipment. So, and we are obligated legally to meet the water pollution rules because we do have water pollution permits. And so our water is treated and then we conduct testing to ensure it will comply with the necessary standards as outlined in water pollution rules. Based on the permissible levels proposed in the standard, there's no difficulty we foresee in being able to meet. So that's from our position. Whether the farmer is taking water from another source, then that is a different. They may have to do their own testing in terms of making sure they take a sample and send to an external lab to do the necessary testing. Yeah, Ms. Ramkilawan, if you want to add anything.
No, Mr. Karim, I believe you covered it.
All right, great. I'm seeing Dr. Platzer has his hand up. I think he has something he wants to contribute. Go ahead, Christoph. You're muted.
I just wanted to clarify on the technology as well, which was asked from someone which technology a farmer could use to treat his wastewater. Again, it has to be the wastewater from the house or equivalent wastewater. And I think for just households, in order to get to a good quality, really, one of the best ways to treat it would be the use of constructed wetlands, maybe with some sort of chlorination in the end. That would be the most suitable way of producing wastewater, which could be reused for farmer irrigation as well.
Thanks, Christoph, and thanks for introducing the element of some sort of nature-based solution. I mean, a lot of our interventions have been engineered so far, and there is a tide that is telling us that some of these options may not necessarily be the best, or may be complemented with nature-based solutions like wetlands and so on. Yeah, I'm seeing a hand raised from John Lewis. John, you can proceed.
Yes, good morning, everyone, and thanks for taking my raised hand. Regarding the question that I posed, using what technology is being recommended, I raised that question from the backdrop of IoTs and having instant, or I should say dynamic testing of water sources and water supplies using IoTs. I think the lab method of doing water testing may be a bit dated. I mean, while it's still practical, it might be a bit dated, and it might be better to have the standard support some sort of, immediate testing, because by the time you use a lab, given the turnaround time, chances are the damage might already have been done. Maybe if there's a dynamic testing using some sort of technology, it might be something that we would want to invest in at the start, as opposed to trying to, bring it in afterwards. I mean, farms all over the world have this type of facility, so it shouldn't be too far-fetched to have something started like this here at the onset of this very important standard, so that farms and other facilities, factories. I have been a particular company many years ago when I did risk management right there in Makoya, and they were dealing with chemicals, and the chemicals were seeping into the ground and going across into the arable land just across the road where there was a lot of farming going on, and these are very toxic chemicals. So I think it is something that this immediate testing is something that we should try to push from the beginning, rather than have it come up as a consequence. That's just my 2 thoughts on that.
Okay, thanks, John. I think that's a valid point. There are things that we need to consider in terms of the entire monitoring regime, how often it's going to be done. I think the EMA has a sort of a requirement in terms of how often they would assess these things. And, this is a really crucial point. So we have to ensure that we monitor appropriately to ensure that these things are safe. There's a sort of a comment or recommendation from Mr. Rampasad that I would probably refer to our colleague from the Ministry of Agriculture, Ms. Shah. And it's talking about integrating some of the aspects of this water testing into the, it's saying the agricultural incentive plan, the farmer agri incentive plan, but there's a more updated policy called the GAP policy, which was introduced, last year, I think. And there was some introduction or some talk of it in our presentations here today. So perhaps based on that backdrop, I will ask Ms. Shah to tell us what her thoughts are in terms of including these elements into either the GAP policy or the farmer agri incentive plan. Ms. Shah, over to you.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you for the question, Mr. Richard Rampasad. My contribution will be from the engineering point of view, relating to more the infrastructure type of works which we do at the ministry. And I would just firstly state that there are advantages and some disadvantages of reusing wastewater. So applying the treated wastewater in agriculture and landscaping irrigation applications helps in conserving fresh water and reducing fertilizer application. So we must take note that the advantages of the reuse of the wastewater would be for applying nutrients to the soil, the nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, that is got from the animal waste from livestock and so on. Now that would not entail the domestic wastewater though, but the domestic wastewater would entail the human waste or the soaps and detergents, and we still do get the nitrogen and phosphorus nutrients obtained from these domestic waste. The disadvantage, although, from the wastewater would be the heavy metals, right? These toxic salts, such as the heavy metals, such as copper, iron, lead, zinc, manganese. These are the heavy metals got from the wastewater, and that part of the wastewater would be disadvantageous to use for irrigation, because it will it would affect health in humans, and that is where we have to be cautious. Now, these heavy toxic soils, as Dr. Platzer mentioned, they are not found in the domestic wastewater. So this is not going to be any major problem. But with respect to the good agricultural practices, I would definitely recommend that we continue the use of disinfectants like the chlorine bleach for destroying the E. coli and so on. And with respect to engineering, we have actually done research where we use a sequence of steps in the treatment of the effluent produced by farmers. We have been doing research where you will have a sequence of steps where you have ponds for collection of the raw and treated black water. And from these ponds, you have the aeration pond, secondary pond, and then the chlorination, where that water is then stored in a storage tank so that it will be able to, the pollutants will be disintegrated over time. So some research is being done with respect to treatment of wastewater for farmers when use of for irrigation. There have also been the biogas digester. Research has been done over the years with that. That is also a method of using the wastewater reefs. So I will close off by saying that the chlorine and bleach, we must use these things to be in to satisfy the requirements for the wastewater reuse. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Shah, for those pieces of information in terms of what work is being done, etc. And I think in response directly to the question, some of the things that have been raised is it's clear that these elements of these standards could be incorporated into new agricultural policy or in different iterations going forward so that persons understand what is required for its safe use. We just have a couple more minutes before we end. So there are some comments and some follow-up questions that I'm seeing here. One is in terms of the testing, right? And then there's another one in terms of the biosolids. But I will say that this standard does not refer to the biosolids that are produced. So it does not address or deal with that. So perhaps that is another area where we could look into developing a standard to address that specific component of wastewater treatment. In terms of the testing, somebody, I think it's Mr. Rampasad, is asking about what labs are available in Trinidad. As mentioned before, the TTBS has labs that does testings. We have DMA that does some testing and analysis. Some of the parameters can be assessed using in-field test kits. Then you also have private labs. You have Kariri, and well, I would be remiss of me to not mention that the Faculty of Food and Agriculture at the university recently launched an agro-environmental testing lab that also does water quality testing. So there are a host of options that persons can utilize to acquire information on testing. Let me see, I think there's a comment that came from the YouTube stream. I'm reading the question and I'm not convinced that we may be able to provide a response to it just yet. But if my colleague from MPU, Ms. Ganga Prasad, is still present, perhaps, although she's not on the panel, she could provide some sort of, insight into the progress of the IWRM policy and, well, the Water Information Management Platform, which is a recent thing that we are trying to develop in Trinidad. How does that relate to or provide alerts for flooding? I know that these things are not necessarily very relevant to what we are talking about, but they are also key national issues. So I will pose that question or comment for response to Ms. Ganga Prasad.
Yep, thank you, Ronald. So I'll briefly reply to these. The first one, the IWRM policy. So the first draft, the draft was finalized and submitted for approval, and comments were made. We integrated those comments in 2022, and right now the draft is waiting for executive approval. So the time frame really depends on how long that executive approval will take. For the second question, the water information management platform. So we're actually in the process of determining the scope of this platform and determining what type of information will be there. Right now, we're looking at quantity and quality data, not alerts for impending flooding. So I think that will be outside of the scope of the water information management platform.
Okay, great. Thanks, Samantha. I'm seeing quite a few questions. I will just or comments. I will just perhaps go on for 2 minutes more to see, try to address as much as we can, and then we will close off our sessions. So I know we also have Dr. Mark Dukaran from the Ministry of Health. And it seems most of you guys aren't concerned too much about health because nobody asked any questions that we could pose to Dr. Dukaran. So I will ask him a question. Dr. Dukaran, based on the standard, based on the parameters that are assessed, and based on the nature or the applicability of the standards towards agriculture and landscaping uses, would you say that it is considered safe? Dr. Dukaran, over to you. Yeah.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. These standards were in line with international standards, WHO and FAO. And of course, they were tested and used in other countries before. So definitely, as someone was saying before, risk is based on costs and benefits. So we have advantages, we have disadvantages. But we know with climate change, we would have some concern for water in the future because, of course, we know that the dry seasons are becoming drier and rainy seasons are becoming rainier. So I would consider it as a beneficial trade-off for these standards to be adopted. I mean, yes, they are meeting all the requirements. Before we move from agriculture, from agricultural product to a food product, we have additional processing which would eliminate any risk that would pose to consumers. Of course, in agriculture, a lot of concerns or a lot of responsibility is shouldered by the farmers themselves. So although there are standards, we know that there are errant farmers who would conduct activities that they should not be doing. For example, somebody mentioned pesticides. So we know we have standards whereby pesticide after spraying for a number of days should not be eaten. But of course, we have errant farmers who would spray today and harvest tomorrow. So we know that these standards, we know that persons sometimes don't do the correct thing, but definitely the trade-off with this is very good. We know that in the past as well, we have seen farmers pumping water directly from drains. We know that farmers pump water from canals that probably have more contaminants than what we are using as standards now. So if it is regulated, we would tend to have farmers having a water supply that would be relatively safe.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Dukaran, for providing that clarity and for assuring the attendees and agencies represented here that the standards or the proposed standards 664 is something that is, safe and something that is not, detrimental to public health in any form or fashion. There were a couple other questions, but I see that some of my colleagues would have addressed them in the chat. Again, if you have any further questions, feel free to email the TTBS, and the committee will address these questions in, subsequently when we move forward to finalizing the standard. I think, I will end the Q&A here. I trust that, you all are pleased with all the questions that we would have responded to, noting the limited time that we have and the fact that everybody may, be zoomed out with all these online meetings, etc. I will not have this be prolonged any longer. And as I said, any questions you all could email the TTBS and seek any further clarification, which will be communicated to the committee. Without any further delay, I thank you all for all your contributions for this Q&A session and all the presenters as well as the panelists who joined on later on for providing the responses to all our participants here today. And without going on too much longer, I would like to pass on to the acting executive director, of the TTBS, Mr. Rodney Ramnath, to provide some closing remarks. So once again, thank you, and over to Mr. Ramnath.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rupnarayan. In closing, I would just like to thank, first of all, the stakeholders who have attended today. And thank you for your very good questions and comments. This will help us in ensuring that the standard is suitable for practice and implementation. I'd like to thank also our presenters who came from the University of the West Indies, the Ministry of Public Utilities, the Environmental Management Authority, the Ministry of Health, our AKUT technical consultant. Thanks to all of those persons who would have contributed to the presentations today, as well as the moderation session that we just came out of. I would also like to thank our internal TTBS staff who have been working on the standard, the manager of the standardization division, Ms. Beverly Monroe, who is an officer in standardization division, Mr. Kester Sulal, who represented our labs. So I'd just like to say it was a very good and informative session. And thank you all very much for coming out and providing your comments. And with that, have a good morning, everyone. And we will end this morning's proceedings.